If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Chris. I'm lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace. And right now we are in the midst of an interesting conversation. It's called Be Rich because of the fact that all of our groups, our small groups, we have special groups that we created for it as well, are moving through Financial Peace University together right now. And it's been amazing to hear the stories that are even coming out of that. I think we're about 3 weeks in, a little over 3 weeks in right now. And this past week, I had multiple people come up to me and just thank me for the fact that all of us are going through this. I had one conversation the other night, and I hear this all the time, but this individual comes to me and says, listen, Chris, I just want to let you know, I didn't believe you. And I said, I'm used to that. She said, I didn't believe you. I decided I would do Financial Peace University because my friend told me I had to, but I didn't believe you that it was going to actually impact my life. And she actually shared the two things that I hear the most as it pertains to how God works through this. She said, one, I've never experienced God this way. I can't believe that I'm actually able to experience God in this aspect of my life that I've never experienced him in before. And then the second thing she said is the other thing that I love to hear. She said, I can't believe that a church would care about this aspect of my life. She said, every time I've ever heard a church talk about finances, it's all about giving. She said, I've never, ever had a church care about this aspect of my life. And she said it's been life-changing, which is incredible, incredible. And so I just want to encourage you, this is the last week that you can get into a group. If you're not in a group, make sure that you sign up for a group moving forward. And if you are in a group, make sure, finish strong, finish all the way through it. Make sure that you're consistent with that. You say, well, I missed a week, jump back into it. You're going to be fine. You can catch up. Do not miss out on what God wants to do in your life through this. 1 Timothy chapter 6 says this, teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all that we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich. Say be rich. Be rich. Oh, come on. What was that? That was sad. Say be rich. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future so that they may experience true life. This is where we're going. This is what God's calling us to, true life. And we don't just want to be intentioned for impact. We want to be positioned for impact. So stay strong in that. At the same time, here on Sunday, we're doing something a little bit different. Because while our groups are moving through that, here on Sunday, what we're doing is we're building the foundation for that. Because the foundation for how we follow God in any area of our life, including our finances, the foundation is the relationship that we have with him. The foundation for our faith, any step of faith that we take, is the relationship that we have with him. And so what we've been doing here for the last couple of weeks is we've been looking at individuals in Scripture that had unique and powerful relationships with God. Relationships that very few people have, that experienced God in amazing ways. And we've been asking this question. What made that possible? What was different about the way that they engaged God or pursued God or followed God that allowed them to know God better than most people who've ever lived? So we started with Abraham, and we looked at this unique aspect of Abraham, that even when things went sideways, even when it looked like God wasn't good, Abraham still trusted God's heart. Then last week we looked at Moses, and we saw how Moses understood and connected to this incredible passion for people that God has. That's at the core of who he is. And today what I want to do is I want to build on that. And to do that, I want to look at the story of an individual that scriptures, well, they describe in one of the most amazing ways that I think you could ever be described. It calls this individual a man after God's own heart. Can you imagine that being said of you? that you're a man after God's own heart or woman after God's own heart? That's an incredible thing to be said of you. And scriptures say, no, this is the kind of relationship that this person had with God. In Acts, it talks about this. Acts chapter 13, it says, after removing Saul, I'll tell you a little bit of the story in just a second, he made David their king. God testified concerning him. Now, don't miss this, because it's not that other people said that David was a man after God's own heart. No, God said this. This is how God described the relationship that he had with David. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Now, I don't know how you want to be described. But if it's possible to be described that way, I want to be described that way. What an incredible thing for God to say about you. So the question is this: what allowed David to have that kind of relationship with God? Or maybe another way to say it is this: what is it that caused God to say that about him? To see it, I want to take you to this really interesting moment in David's life. I'll give you a little bit of the backstory for those of you who don't know the story of David. As it talked about in Acts, Saul was the current king of the nation of Israel. As a matter of fact, Saul was the first king of the nation of Israel. But Saul wasn't actually following God the way that God had called him to follow him. And so God decides that he's going to move on to David. So David is anointed at a very young age as the next king of the nation of Israel. If you've ever read a children's Bible, this is a really exciting story because they go through all of David's brothers and they finally get to David, and God says, this is the one. This is the one who's going to be the next king. And they anoint him the next king of Israel. And in the children's Bible, and maybe you've been in church for a long time, you learned this story in Sunday school, and you learned it in Sunday school, you said, what an incredible moment. David is anointed the next king. The problem that I have with that is this. Do you know what happens when you're anointed the next king and there's still a current king? We tell the story like, oh, what a wonderful moment. I don't know that it actually was. Like, you get to be the next king. That's all right. I'll wait. Maybe you can anoint me after Saul dies. That might be better. Why? Well, because the story is very consistent. When the next king is anointed before the current king is dead. Almost all kings act the same way. And Saul's no exception. So what does Saul try to do? Well, he does what current kings do. He tries to kill him. And we don't know the exact time frame, but for about 10 to 15 years, David runs for his life. And it's not fun. You can read all about it in the Psalms. And as David is running for his life, we find this story. And in this story, I think we see why God said that about him. Let me take you to it. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. You know where that is, right? But did you hear that? Because this is another place where I think we picture the story a little bit wrong. Because some of us might think, oh, well, Saul was pursuing David. He sent And in our minds, he sends out this posse of 20 people to go find him. No. 3,000 people. This is not a small manhunt. This is not an easy to evade manhunt. This is massive. This is an army coming after him. And so Saul begins to pursue David. It says he came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Yes, that's what it means. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." And so Saul goes into the cave to relieve himself. And in the back of the cave, David and his men are hiding. And David's men come to him and say, "This is it. We've been running. We've been hiding. It's been miserable. But it's over. He's right there. All you have to do is take him out. I mean, this is a gift from God. Look at what God has made possible. Look at what God has done." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. So David creeps up, but he doesn't kill him. He just cuts off a corner of his robe, which I think answers the question that some of you were asking earlier of which one was it when he had to relieve himself? If you can cut off a corner of his robe, I think it answers the question. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. What? So he creeps up. He doesn't kill him. He cuts off a corner of his robe, and then he comes back, and it says that he's conscience-stricken. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is anointed of the Lord." Don't miss the fact that he used the word Lord 3 times there. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So David not only doesn't kill him himself, he doesn't allow his men to kill him. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord, the king!" So Saul leaves the cave, and after he gets a certain distance, we don't know exactly how long, but far enough, David comes out and calls out to him. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds. So my hand will not touch you." And so David comes out and says, "Why are you believing these lies that I'm trying to harm you, that I'm against you?" And he keeps saying this. He keeps talking about the Lord's anointed. And the reality is that we could spend an entire series just in this story. I mean, there's so many things that you can talk about here as you move through this story. You can look at the irony, and there's incredible irony in the fact that David isn't willing to harm Saul because he's God's anointed. But Saul is trying to kill David, God's anointed. I mean, the incredible irony of that conversation, as David is calling that out, is phenomenal. You could look at it, we could talk through the leadership lesson that you see here, which is significant. I remember learning this years ago. I was working at UPS at the time, and I remember being challenged on something, and immediately I thought of this story. My manager had made a decision that I disagreed with, and so I went back to the guys that were part of our area, part of my team, and I shared with them that management's made a bad decision, and we're going to do what they asked us to do, but not because I think it's the right thing to do, but because of the fact that we just need to do what they told us to do. And I remember there was an older manager who overheard me, and he was super quiet. This guy didn't talk ever. And he comes over to me and he says, "Chris, we need to talk." I was like, "You can speak?" No, I didn't. We had talked before, but he said, "We need to talk right now." I said, "What? What about?" It's like, "About what you just said to your team." I said, "What?" I told them that we were going to do what they told us to do. He said, "You need to understand, when you undermine the authority over you, you undermine your authority." And what you've just taught your team to do is to undermine your authority. All the authority you have comes from the authority over you. And that was poor leadership. And immediately I actually thought of this story because it's the exact opposite of what David does. David, in this moment, teaches his men how to engage the appointed one, the anointed one of God. Not with what he says with his words, but with how he lives. It's an incredible lesson on leadership. But that's not the most powerful part of the story. The most powerful part of the story, I think, is found in this line that we see right after he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe, where it says this: "Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe." Now, let me ask you this. Why? He does this, and it says that it cuts right to the core of him. He's distraught. Why? Maybe it was an expensive robe. I don't think so. So why? Why does it bother David so much? Let me read you what it says again right after this happens. He says to his men, "The Lord," it's the first time he mentions him, "forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." The reason David is distraught is not because he's dishonored Saul, but he understands what we just talked about authority. And he understands that in this moment he has dishonored God. And it crushes him. He realizes, wait, this wasn't just an act of dishonoring Saul. This was actually an act of dishonoring God. And it crushes him, which is amazing to me. It's amazing to me that he's even thinking about it. It's incredible to me that he's even thinking about it. None of us would be thinking about that at a time like this. I mean, he's running for his life. The guy in front of him is trying to kill him. He's been running. They're trying to figure out where they're going to eat, how they're going to survive. And almost every single one of us, I would venture to actually say, every single one of us in this room, if we found ourselves in that situation, you know what we would be consumed by? We would be consumed by, okay, God, what are you going to do for me in this situation? His men were consumed by that. His men looked at him and said, look at what God has done for you in this situation. He's made it possible for you to kill the king. And now we have an opportunity out. And if I was David, that's exactly what I would be thinking about. Okay, God, how are you going to get me out of this? How are you going to work this out? I don't deserve to be living like this. I don't deserve to be running for my life. I don't deserve to be in fear every day. I don't deserve this. All of us, that would be what consumes us. What we deserve. And what we think God should do about it. But in this moment, that's not what consumed David. What consumed David was what God deserved from him. He wasn't upset because he thought God had failed him. He was upset because he thought he had failed God. He wasn't upset because he thought God hadn't done what God needed to do right by him. Because he hadn't gotten what he deserved. No, he was upset because he felt that God hadn't gotten what he deserved from him. I can't believe that would be his mindset in this moment. You know why I can't believe that would be his mindset in this moment? Because I'm not running from my life. I don't live every day in fear of what's going to happen or where I'm going to eat, and yet I'm still most of my life consumed with what I deserve. And I move through my life and I move through my day asking the question, am I getting what I deserve? And you do too. This is what makes you angry. I don't deserve for that person to cut me off, and I don't deserve for my wife to treat me that way, and I don't deserve for my kids to treat me the way they do every day of my life. And yet David, even in this situation, his primary concern was not what he deserved from God, but what God deserved from him. Have you ever even asked that question? Forget about the idea of it being something that consumes us. Have you ever even asked the question? Is God getting from me what he deserves? Most of us have never asked the question. Most of us, our entire journey with God is just a question of whether or not I'm getting from him what I deserve. And if I'm getting from him what I deserve or what I expect, then I'll continue to follow him. If I'm not, then I want nothing to do with him. None of us have actually stopped to ask the question, is he getting from us what he deserves? Have you ever stopped to think about, the first time that I realized this, it crushed me. I sat and wept for hours Have you ever thought about the fact that God never gets from his creation what he deserves? What do you think that feels like? And not only that, very few people even think about it. But David, even in this moment, was consumed by it. Because, you see, David didn't live his life obsessed with his own heart. He was obsessed with someone else's. You could say he was a man after God's own heart. And so in this moment, the question wasn't, how do I feel about what just happened? The question was, how does God feel about how I just dishonored him? And it crushed him. A couple weeks ago, we talked about this fundamental lie that the enemy introduces in the garden, that God is stealing from you. That he doesn't actually want something for you, he wants something from you. And so he's constantly just going to take from you, and if you want to live, you've got to go your own way. You can't follow him because that's not the way to life. He's not going to give you life, he's not going to lead you to life, he's going to take life from you. And that God's stealing from you. And he comes to us with this lie every time we're confronted with a decision of whether we're going to trust God and follow him or go our own way. And the lie is always there. No. If you trust him, he's going to take from you. And you're not going to know love the way that you want to know love. And you're not going to have the relationship that you want to have. And you're not going to have the things that you want to have. You're not going to live the life that you need to live if you actually trust him and follow him. It's the same lie. It's always the same lie. And the enemy comes to Adam and Eve and says, listen, he's stealing from you. And so they make the decision to walk away from him. The reality is that in the garden, there was a thief, but it wasn't him. And he wasn't stealing from us, but we stole from him. We stole from him the honor that he deserves, the love that he deserves, the glory that he deserves. And we do it all the time. And we think about whether it's right or wrong. We think about whether it's beneficial or not. But very few of us think about his heart. What it does to his heart. David was different. You see it not just in this moment, you see it over and over again in the Psalms. I love how he does this in the Psalms because you see this journey. And it's important for us to see the journey because many of us sit here and think, I'm so far from that. How would I ever get there? I don't know how I would live my life consumed with his heart. I don't know how that would be even something that I consistently think about. But I love this about David because in the Psalms, he takes us on this journey. Over and over again, he takes us on this journey where you begin the psalm. And at the beginning of so many of David's psalms, you know what he's consumed with? He's consumed with what he deserves. And so many of the psalms start with, God, where are you? What are you doing? Why can't you take this enemy out? Why are you letting this happen to me? He starts consumed with where most of us start. He starts consumed with his own heart. But then in the psalm, what he does is he begins to actually reflect on the reality of life. He begins to reflect on what he actually deserves. And the reality that he's actually been rescued from what he deserves. And then he begins to move through not just moving away from what he deserves. He recognizes what he deserves. He recognizes what he's been given above what he deserves. And then he comes out of it. And as he moves through that, he realizes, oh my goodness, God, look at what you deserve. Just process the question in your own life. Most of us came in today consumed with, okay, what is it that I deserve? Or what is it that I want from God? Or what is it that I need from God or need him to do or need him? And you can tell this by our prayer requests. When you look at what you pray for, it reveals a lot about what we think about God and how we engage God. Most of our prayer requests are what? About what God can do for us and what we want God to do in our life or what we want God to do for other people. What we want to see happen for other people. When's the last time you prayed that God would get what he deserves? And most of us have come in, and this is what we're focused on, because this is the beginning of the journey. But take just a second and think about what you actually deserve. The scriptures are pretty clear about that. Well, what I actually deserve is death. But not only has he rescued me from it, but he has over and over and over again poured into my life. He has pursued me. He has loved me. He has pursued you. He has loved you. He's brought you here. He's adopted you into his family. Jesus gave his life for you. It doesn't matter who you are, where you've been. This is available to you. He has pursued you to love you better than anyone else in your life. So what does he deserve? Scriptures are pretty clear on this too. My life. My life. This is a massive step in maturity. Listen to me very carefully. This is a massive step in maturity. It's the movement from, I want to make sure I get what I deserve, to, I want to make sure he gets from me what he deserves. But you have to change the question. You have to change the question. But if you want to know a relationship with God like David, you have to decide to care about his heart. The reality is, listen. The reality is that for most of creation, God will never get what he deserves. From all of creation, God will never get what he deserves. But that should not be true of us. And we'll never be able to give him what he actually deserves. But it should drive us. To wake up every day and say, you might not get it anywhere else. And no one else may be concerned about your heart or your honor, but I will be. I will be. Are you willing to change the question? Are you willing to be someone after God's own heart? It doesn't start with big things. It starts with small things. It starts with reminding yourself every day. It starts with being faithful. Listen, I want to honor him any way that I can, the simple ways, the day-to-day ways. I want to do that. It's interesting. I was talking to Hannah about this after the first service, and I said to her, I said, Hannah, we've been talking about this for a month now here at Hoboken Grace. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, what we're talking about in worship, it has everything to do with this. Because most of us come into worship and we ask, okay, am I getting from this what I want to get from this? Do I like this worship? People talk to me a lot about whether they like the worship. I don't really care if you like the worship. That's not why we do it. The question isn't, okay, do I like it or how it impacts my heart? That's not the question. The question is, does it impact his heart? And so I'm going to bring the band back up. And I want to invite you to change the question. But I don't want to just talk about it. I want to give you a chance to do it. And so even with something small, such as singing a song, I want to invite you to change the way that you do it. And to go into this next song and not say, am I comfortable with, or I don't know how to clap very well. People are going to make fun of me. No one's paying attention to you. And it doesn't matter. Honor him, celebrate him the way he deserves. I might not be able to do it perfectly. I might not remember to do it in every moment. I might be the only one. It doesn't matter. David lived his life to stand before him one day and say, I gave it all for your heart. I love your heart. And I did everything that I could to celebrate, honor, and care for your heart. Will you stand with us and celebrate him the way that he deserves?